Good morning and welcome to Business Morning. I'm Chimeze Obi Iwagu. We begin with the global oil market update as prices bounced back in early trade today with U.S. crude jumping over $1 lifted by hopes that a meeting between OPEC members and allied producers on Thursday will trigger output cuts to shore up prices that have crumbled amid the coronavirus pandemic. Brent crude was up by 75 cents at $32.62 per barrel after falling 3.6% on Tuesday. U.S. West Texas Intermediate crude rose $1.30 to $24.93 a barrel after dropping 9.4% in the previous session. Thursday's video conference meeting between members of the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries and its allies, including Russia, is widely expected to be more successful than their gathering in early March that ended in failure to extend cuts and a price war between Saudi Arabia and Russia amid slumping demand, but doubts remain over the role of the United States in any production curbs. Saudi Arabia, OPEC member countries, and Russia are likely to agree to cut output, but that accord could be dependent on whether the United States would go along with the cut. And in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, businesses and their leaders are falling over each other to demonstrate their care and support. Globally, there is concerted effort by the private sector to find creative ways of contributing to tackling the pandemic. Now, some businesses are adopting their manufacturing systems to produce some of the essential materials and equipment required to combat the pandemic, such as sanitizers, ventilators, testing kits, and so on. Others, especially those in the biochemical and pharmaceutical industries, have intensified their research and development efforts towards a solution. It's literally all hands on deck. Now, this brings us to the question of the role of corporate social responsibility and economic development. What should corporate social responsibility be like post-COVID-19? And that's my conversation with Professor Kenneth Amaechi, a public philosopher and professor of business and sustainable development at the University of Edinburgh Business School in the UK. Good morning. Thank you for joining us, Professor Amaechi.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, CSR could mean different things to different people. As a sustainable development expert, what is CSR?
Corporate social responsibility, in a nutshell, is about how companies manage their negative impacts on society and also how they can enhance their positive impacts on society and the environment. But most of the time, people tend to see corporate social responsibility, especially when they want to focus on the social part of it. That's more of philanthropy, and that's what we see mostly in Africa and also in Nigeria in particular, because people tend to see it as doing something extra for society and for the environment. So, but in a classic sense of it, corporate social responsibility is about corporate self-regulation. And by corporate self-regulation, I mean how companies can voluntarily choose to reduce their negative impacts on society and enhance their positive impacts as well. But even if companies do not want to enhance their positive impacts, what they should do as much as possible to reduce their negative impacts, because you can't rob Peter to pay Paul. So for every business that engages in one activity or the other, they are likely to cause negative impacts. What they do to reduce those negative impacts are essentially core to the CSR agenda.
Now, with the outbreak of the coronavirus, we have seen a lot of corporate organizations and governments come up with their technical know-how on corporate social responsibility. What do you make of all of these, all hands being on deck?
It's very interesting, isn't it, in a way, because companies, it's good to see them contributing positively to society. So again, you can see it as a form of corporate social responsibility. So that they're able to come out and show solidarity, probably deploy their resources, which might include money, and sometimes their infrastructure or even capabilities. So these are positive things that we expect of companies at this point in time. So from that perspective, I see that as something good that corporations and business leaders, as well as individuals in Nigeria, are rising up to this challenge. But it's, it would be good to see if this is sustained or if this will also change the way business is done in the continent. So I would say at the moment it's positive, but also people can be a bit cynical and say, why would companies come out only when we have problems? So when it was everything was there and it was to a large extent peaceful, what were these business leaders doing? Why did they pay good attention to their negative impact? A good number of them will use generators, for example, but you wonder, where else can they get electricity from? Some might also have poor business practices in terms of human relations, as well as community relations. So these are some of the problems currently there that sometimes businesses take for granted. But one can also appreciate what they're doing now because we are all in it together. So either they may be pursuing from the perspective of self-interest, and they want to protect themselves because the COVID-19 doesn't recognize class or status, right? So in that sense, it's all in our interest to ensure that we protect ourselves from this horrible disease. So I see it also maybe as a form of self-preservation, but one can also extend it further to see what companies are doing. Some of them might be riding on the wave of PR. It's good PR anyway. It's also about positive impressions and impression management. So one can see also that it might also be as a result of peer pressure. Company A has done it, and if I'm not doing it, then it raises the question of why am I not in the game? So there are many factors that could be driving what we are seeing at the moment, but it'd be nice to sit back a bit and reflect and see if there are better ways companies can continuously engage in contributing to positive outcome in society.
So how can CSR be better done for sustainable development?
That's a very big question, right? One way I would suggest, especially in our country where we're thinking about weak institutions, if companies can focus on addressing the root causes of some of these problems. So if you're thinking about poor health outcomes, because what the COVID-19 has done elegantly is to expose the weaknesses in our health system. And we can comfortably, or not comfortably, but it's something we can appreciate. And the other thing also it has done is to reveal the gap in the capitalist system. So where capitalism is pursued for its own sake and social welfare is not taken into consideration, it exposes the weakness in that kind of system. And that's basically what we are seeing. We are asking people to stay at home, but the government might be doing its bit to support them, but it also shows that we don't have a strong social safety net. And that lack in itself is exposing the shallowness of the capitalist system we have in Nigeria. So in order for companies to contribute to strengthening institutions, for me, that will be the retest of corporate social responsibility, where they're going to address the root problem, the root cause, as opposed to the symptoms. Say, for example, I would like to see a situation whereby post-COVID-19, companies would invest more in strengthening the health systems. Imagine a situation where some of this money, or a good number of money coming from this, will be channeled to working with the Federal Ministry of Health, for example, to strengthen the health system, to strengthen the public sector. Because if the public sector is not strengthened, some of these issues that companies grapple with, whether it's poverty alleviation, whether it is environmental issues, or even human rights issues, will always be there. And they will continue to distract them from their core business, which is in terms of creating wealth in a responsible manner. So I would want CSR to focus more on institution building and not this handout or ad hoc approach to corporate social responsibility.
Now, do you see corporate social responsibility eventually changing post-COVID-19?
It would be nice to see it change, but that's the test of the pudding is in the eating, isn't it? In a way, because we need to wait to see what companies will actually do. When there are no pressures as we have, what we normally see is that companies tend to relax. And when they relax, they don't do as much. And one of the problems, I've done a lot of research over the years looking at corporate social responsibility in Nigeria, and the problem is corporate leadership. Corporate leaders pay lip service to corporate social responsibility. If it doesn't make money, if they don't see a direct link to to what you may call the bottom line, which is their profit, they hardly pay attention to it. And they do not play the long-term game. So it's all about what can we get or gain in the interim, whether in the next 2 months or 3 months. And CSR managers are put under pressure to demonstrate the business case. And the business case has to be something that happens overnight. So, and it shows the shallowness of thinking around corporate social responsibility in Nigeria. And the problem of that is rests squarely on leadership. So I would like to see business leaders in Nigeria have a different take, have a long-term view, knowing that their businesses can only do well in a society that is flourishing. Poverty is not good for business. War is not good for business. Environmental degradation is not good for business. Diseases are not good for business, as this COVID-19 has shown. So it's for business leaders to move back a bit and see how they can collaboratively work whether with the government or with the civil society to strengthen our institutions. And if they don't do this, I'm afraid nothing will change. And I don't see a lot changing because they may also not have the requisite pressures to make them change. Because once this crisis disappears, I suspect it's likely to be business as usual because the government is not putting pressure on them to be socially responsible. The employees are not putting pressures on them to be socially responsible. And even consumers. How many people in Nigeria will look at the CSR profile of a company before they decide either to do business with them or even use their products? So where you have weak actors, weak stakeholders, it becomes quite difficult for companies to engage in what you may call the true CSR. And that's what we're currently missing in Nigeria. But it will be nice to see how the different actors can learn from this crisis to hold companies accountable. And probably that will also help companies to move things forward. But like I said earlier, leadership is very critical. And it would be nice to see new breed of business leaders in Nigeria that are willing to try a new way of doing things and move us away from this business as usual that has not helped Nigeria and the world indeed.
Right, from what you have said, I believe that buttresses the argument that the profit maximization objective of companies is sometimes in conflict with commitment to strong CSR, right?
You might suggest that in the interim. The classic textbook on economics or finance might suggest that a company is doing something extra. So if you do something extra, you're spending shareholders' money. And if you're spending shareholders' money, it is into your profit. But you can also see your corporate social responsibility as a form of investment. Companies make investment in research and development, and these investments are there for the long term. So if you have a good working relationship with your communities, that in itself is a way to safeguard you from potential risks. Think about some of the oil companies and what they did in Ogoniland. Today, some of them are bearing the cost and burden of the mistakes they did in the past. So having good community relationship in itself is a social investment that should help the company and also contribute to the bottom line. Like I said earlier, poverty is not good for business. So there's no point shying away. And CSR framed as a cost issue also is a distraction. Take, for instance, the use of diesel in Nigeria. Let's assume you're a bank, and a typical bank in Nigeria, let's assume you have 600 branches, and you spend, say, like 1 million naira every month per branch on diesel. So that is already 600 million in a month, and in a year, you're looking at 7.2 billion naira. So reducing the cost of fuel, reducing the cost of dependency on diesel, and thinking about alternative measures, in that sense, becomes a cost-saving and even a profitable venture. So corporate social responsibility is not only about cost minimization, but it can also help you find new ways, new markets. Think about financial inclusion, trying to bring people who are excluded from the market into the market. Think about some of the social innovations that can happen either in the financial services sector or manufacturing sector that can transform the economy and create new ways of doing things. So it's not always about CSR eating into profit, but it requires different thinking, different paradigm to understand how business leaders and businesses can take good advantage of CSR and come up with solutions that address societal needs.
Now, would you agree with the view that CSR is an additional tax on shareholders?
in a way, you can make that argument, especially we are companies, because companies can rightfully say, we've paid our taxes. Why would you want us to do extra? And that's the problem with a country like Nigeria, where you have weak institutions. And companies pay taxes. I mean, there is this false dichotomy, which I've written with some colleagues recently, where you have the taxman, in this case, Federal Inland Revenue Authority, and which says that our mandate is just to collect tax, but we are not in charge of the accountability part of it. That in itself is bizarre. So you can say, well, that's how things are currently arranged in Nigeria. That's fine. But where you don't have accountability built into the system, it becomes quite difficult to ask companies to do more when they have paid their taxes. But imagine a situation also where companies can proactively engage with the government, engage with FIRS, in this case, to say, we want to know how our taxes are used. So that in itself can be one way of safeguarding companies from this constant pressure and pull to pick up the problems created by inefficiencies of the government. So yes, on one hand, one can say, well, it comes across as an extra tax, especially when you're asking companies to do something in addition. But it is not an extra tax when you're asking companies to internalize their negative externalities. So when a company is polluting, or when a company is using cheap labor, that in itself, asking the company to address it is not taxing the company extra, but rather you're asking the company to pay the true cost or recognize the true value of their input, which in this case might be labor or some environmental resources. And that in itself, that's why I said CSR can be looked at from two perspectives. One is the minimization of negative impact. That in itself is non-negotiable. If you create a negative impact, you need to address it. So that's not asking you to pay extra tax. But the idea of creating positive impact, where the company uses their capabilities to do more for society in terms of creating positive impact, is where the issue around extra taxation might come in. But a way out of it is to ensure that the government does its own bit so that companies don't continually fall into the trap of being asked to do more.
All right, just a quick one before I let you go, Professor. What kind of incentives should be put in place by government to motivate companies' commitment to CSR, particularly post-COVID-19?
I think there are some incentives coming up in terms of tax credits. Some government, I think Nigeria is also using that as a way to say, whatever you put into to address public infrastructure deficit, you can recoup through tax. But the issue there is that we need to be sure that companies are not gaming the system, because it's good to say I spent 1 billion naira when in actual sense they haven't spent as much. But also good to ensure that the money is being put to good use, and companies are not just addressing the things that they would like to do and not the critical things that will be good for society. So the tax incentive is there. But I also like to see better regulation. And one of the things we've known through academic research around the world is that where you have good regulation, it tends to help companies to do what they ought to do. So in that case, there is no room for making claims that we are doing something extra, but you are doing what you ought to do in a society in a way that contributes to societal development, economic development, and better environment.
All right, thank you very much for your time, Professor Amaechi. Professor Amaechi is a public professor, philosopher, and professor of business and sustainable development at the University of Edinburgh Business School in the UK. And when Business Morning returns, we'll look at what some of the federal government stimulus packages will mean for the Nigerian capital market. Do stay with us.